Traders, how are you? With Marcello. Today we're doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week. On top of the bank failures that we had the previous week, we have a handful of more bank failures, and we finally got the inflation numbers to go out. Let's go ahead and get started. The bank collapses continued this week. We had a handful of more banks that actually went down. In addition to that, we actually had the inflation data that came out, and we've had basically now, I got the number written here, I believe it's 8 months of kind of declining, kind of easing inflation. The year-over-year inflation is still running at 6%. Remember that these numbers are manipulated by the government. So if they were still calculating the inflation rate, the same rate that they were in the 1980s, the inflation would actually be at 15%, just over 15%. So just keep that in mind. And I'm sure you have seen things like food go up a lot more than 15%, right? I always tell this story. So it's gonna get old, I know, but I went to Five Guys burger spot in the US. I paid 20, I think it was max $24 sometimes for two people, two burgers, two drinks, two fries. And I went recently in the same area and it was $20 just for me. So that would be a 50% increase year over year, 100% in 2 years. So just keep that in mind that these numbers really don't mean anything. The offset bump in gas prices were offset by an increase in things like rent. Excuse me, I said that backwards. So the offset in inflation were offset by the increase in gas prices and also the rent. Food went up by 9.5%, energy 5.2, 3.3 for apparel. New vehicles went up 5.8, and shelter went up by over 8%, which accounts for the more than 70% of the increase in the inflation. We had the fourth banking failure, which was First Republic, the kind of regional bank crisis. I think there was a report that said something, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but Bank of America had something like $15 billion in new deposits. There was also a report from the Wall Street Journal that said there's 186 banks that are in a similar situation than the Silicon Valley Bank, which actually did collapse. And I did a video on that. If you guys wanted to see that, it's here on the channel. Overall, I'm not going to go region by region this week because most of the exchanges around the world, everything basically collapsed. There's some stock exchanges that went down over 7-8%. Bitcoin and crypto news. This one I thought was really interesting. There was a bank called Signature Bank, which was a regional bank in New York that the feds took over. And I don't say that this bank collapsed due to the fact that there's a gentleman named Barney Frank. He was a senator that helped to create the Dodd-Frank Act, which was what they instituted after the great collapse in 2008 and 2009. He worked for this bank, and he basically said, I quote, "I think part of what happened was that regulators wanted to send a very strong anti-crypto message. We became the poster boy because there was no insolvency based on fundamentals." Now, they had $88 billion in deposits, and about 90% or so was not FDI insured, but essentially they just came in and shut the bank down without, quote unquote, them being insolvent. And this is a guy who worked for the bank, who used to be a senator, saying that, basically they just shut us down because they don't want anybody doing crypto stuff. Now, another thing I found really interesting was the Fed, which is the central bank of the United States, said that no taxpayer money is going to be used for the bailout. Remember, we had Silvergate Bank, which was a crypto bank that collapsed. Then we had Silver Valley Bank. Then after that, we had First Republic. In addition to that, we had Silicon Valley Bank out in the UK that collapsed, which was, I believe, taken over by HSBC. And we had the 17th largest bank in Europe, which was Credit Suisse, go down. And they took the amount of the loan that they took from the government of Switzerland. I got it written down here somewhere. I'll let you guys know that in just a second. Here you go, $54 billion from the Swiss National Bank. Now, it's peculiar to me how the federal bank is going to say, well, we're not going to use taxpayer money, but they're going to inject capital. Now that the federal bank is basically honoring all deposits. So now banks, the executives at the banks, right? Because in Silicon Valley Bank, the CEO sold stock 2 weeks before. They were even giving out bonuses before they collapsed. Now banks can basically just do whatever they want with your money. They can just risk anything, and they know that the government's going to bail them out because the government doesn't want a crisis on their hands, right? So they say no taxpayer money is going to be used, but where are they getting the billions of dollars to put in these banks? They're going to literally print money until the end of time, right? By printing the money, it's going to increase inflation, which is already bad enough right now. And that inflation is the tax that you get. You're going to pay a lot more for things with a lot less because, like I told you guys about the Five Guys, now a $10 hamburger is $20. Is your salary going up by 50% every year? That's why you should learn YouTube or, start a side hustle, start trading, do something because you're going to need it very soon. Crypto obviously exploded due to the situation with the financial instability in the US banks. Even gold and silver spiked quite a bit. Bitcoin went up by almost 37%. It went over 27,000. Commodities, oil had a really bad week. It fell to a 15-month low on Wednesday. U.S. crude collapsed almost 15%. It's about $10 it went down, while international Brent went down over 13%. That went down almost about $10 as well. And this obviously has to do with the situation where if we have a financial crisis, a lot less people are going to go out and spend money, which means that a lot less people are going to spend money on oil. So that's basically the whole idea behind that. According to UBS, which is a huge bank in Europe, they're talking about the lithium extraction in China as being ramped up. And by 2030, they should be accountable for about 1/3 of the world's supply. This to me China seems to be doing all the right things when it comes to, let's call it politics, because they seem to want to control everything that we use. Remember that basically everything is made in China, right? Even babies. So they control everything, and then if you don't do what they want, if you don't do what they want you to do, they can just cut off the materials that we need. Now, there's good news when it comes to Tesla, for example, that's starting to create motors. This is a piece of news that was in the corporate news section where they're going to start developing motors that don't have the rare earth metals, because even a lot more than a third, for example, comes from China. In the manipulation of the metals, the London Metals Exchange found bags full of stones in their warehouses where they should have been nickel. The LME is a 146-year-old world's oldest and largest metals exchange, industrials metals exchange. Now, the question I have is, what if no one has the gold and silver that they claim either? Now, one of the things that you don't know is in the paper market, the futures market, which is what I mainly teach and trade on now, every ounce of gold is literally claimed, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 times, the same ounce. So it's like saying something is in the warehouse and, a million people are claiming that 1 ounce. Imagine the financial fraud and how high things like gold and silver are going to go when this actually comes out. That's one of the big reasons why I always have been a big proponent of silver, because on top of this manipulation and fraud, the demand is skyrocketing thanks to things like the batteries in the electric vehicles and even the solar panels, because they're not finding any new mines. So eventually, I was going to say the proverbial shit is going to hit the fan, excuse my French, and that's when things are going to get really bad. Gold jumped above 1,900 an ounce again. Best week for gold in 3 years. Gold went up by over 6% for the week from 1869 to 1990, while silver had an amazing week. It went over 10% to 2270. Financial and banking news. The Citadel CEO says the U.S. capitalism is breaking down before our eyes after the Fed rescued Silicon Valley Bank. This is part of the reason why I think we're seeing why it's so difficult now to live, right? The United States used to kind of be this beacon for capitalism, and I don't think we're a capitalism society anymore. I mean, think about the Wright brothers, for example. They could just build a plane and just fly it, and now you need a permit to change a wall in your house. That's literally socialism. India takes a leading role in the de-dollarization. Russia's becoming their largest importer of oil over the past year. Remember that India is the 3rd largest importer of oil, the 5th largest economy after US, China, Japan, Germany. Then comes India. Then after that is the UK and France and Italy and all those guys. They now have 35% of their oil coming in from Russia. And what's going to happen is, as more and more people stop using the dollar, a lot more of these dollars are going to come back home, meaning to the US. And most people don't know that the majority of the dollars that have been created are actually overseas. So as more and more people use the dollar less, more and more of those dollars are going to come home, which means that we're going to walk into a hyperinflation situation like Argentina or Venezuela, for example. First Republic Bank is another one of the banks that were saved this week. Their stock collapsed 73% on Monday, despite the measures that the regulator said on, I believe it was Sunday. They're talking about how they're going to backstop everything. Obviously, this is probably going to continue because the fears are well warranted, in my opinion. Credit Suisse, another one of the banks that failed, not in the United States, but in Europe. The 17th, if I'm not mistaken, largest bank in Europe. It's a behemoth. They had to borrow $54 billion, as I mentioned before, from the Swiss National Bank to shore up their books. The European Central Bank, which covers 20 nations that use the euro, they decided to hike rates by 50 basis points to 3%, the highest rates in 2008. Even though we're having this financial market chaos and the banking sector collapses, they're still going to raise rates. Political news, there's a protests that have been pretty significant in the Netherlands and also in France. In Netherlands, it has to do with the politics trying to cut down on their nitrogen footprint to quote unquote save the environment, meaning that if they actually do this, about a third of the farms in Netherlands are going to just close, which is kind of what they want, right? They want to control you with your food and their money. Where's my button at? Wait for it. Macron's move to shun the National Assembly. He wanted to change the pension program to be able to increase the age of the pensions. So instead of issuing a vote, he just went ahead and signed it into law. So there's chaos all over France and in Paris as well. And in a shocking study in Australia, they're showing a 26-fold increase in excess mortality in 2021 and 2022, consistent with the American insurance company findings. What happened in 2001 and 2022? Think about it, guys. In economic news, the tech companies have already been shedding or reported to have shed 290,000 workers since the start of 2022. This is obviously because of I say obviously a lot, don't I? I got to cut that back. Some of you guys let me know in the comments. Thank you for that. They have obviously cut back on their workers due to the fact that they are preparing for this economic crisis that's coming. The February U.S. retail sales month over month were down 0.4% compared to the 0.3% that was expected. And year over year retail sales were at 5.4%. So the consumer, which is almost 70% of the economy in the United States, is still going strong, it looks like. The U.S. Labor Department said that the number of Americans filing for unemployment claims unexpectedly fell last week. This is, again, another indicator which is good for the Fed, which means that they're most likely going to continue to increase interest rates, even though you can see the collapses that's occurring all over the United States and also Europe with the bank collapses. Corporate news, United Airlines, their shares have fallen 5.35%, 5.37% since they reported a quarter one loss. They also have talked about lowering their results due to weaker demand growth in addition to an increase in fuel costs. And Tesla, as I mentioned, they're going to go back to making EVs without the rare earth metals. And this is a bit of a problem for China because, as I mentioned, they've kind of been positioning themselves politically to be able to control a lot of the metals markets. And since everything is made in China, they could just literally cut the United States off, for example. Meta is announcing another 10,000 jobs this year that are going to be cut off, a second round of mass layoffs. Most of the industry is probably going to go through this as well. Samsung is expecting over $230 billion in investment over the next 20 years to develop what they're calling the world's largest chip making base. Remember that since everything is electronic now, everything uses these chips. And T-Mobile has announced that they're going to buy Ryan Reynolds Mint Mobile for $1.35 billion. This is going to allow them to go after the pay-as-you-go customer base because since the middle class is getting destroyed in the United States, a lot more people are choosing pay-as-you-go instead of the monthly bills. Saudi Aramco, the state-controlled oil company for Saudi Arabia, had a breaking net income of $161 billion. That increased by over 46%, their net income, thanks to strong crude oil prices. And in trade news, Iran's economy is starting to reach a lot of agreements with Iraq. They had a 20% increase in trade, in addition to more than 7 million people that have traveled through their borders. This is not good news for the United States due to the fact that since they control a lot of the oil market, there is also a Chinese broker deal to resume diplomatic relations between China and Iran. And that obviously is not good for us due to the fact that if they get together and decide to sell their oil, for example, in euros, it's going to cause that situation that I mentioned about the collapse of the dollar. In technology, BMW is expecting 50% of all their new car sales by 2030 to be all electric. That seems to be speeding up a lot faster than usual. They also want to produce a car that's powered by hydrogen in the second half of the decade. And in international events this week, California reeling already from all the atmospheric rivers that they've had. They're now going to have another snowstorm and rain and wind on Monday. I don't know if I'll try to find this video and I'll tell the guys to add it. There was a guy who was walking, I believe in Tahoe, where the snow was up higher than the roof of his house. And now there's another nor'easter as well in the northeast. That's why they call it a nor'easter. That's going to have quite a bit of significant storms. They're expecting a lot of damage. 250,000 people are without power in multiple states. There was over 900 people canceled, 2,700 flights canceled, and we're talking about winds of up to 45 miles an hour, 72 kilometers per hour from Pennsylvania all the way to Maine. And this is going to continue to happen. International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Putin. Why don't they just go to Russia and arrest him then? It's just like they just talk so much smack. You know what I mean? Like they're not going to do anything. Russia, China, and the U.S. are not part of the ICC, just so you know. And riot police, as I mentioned, clashed with protesters in Paris due to the increase in the pension age. Just so you know, France actually has one of the least working people in the entire world. So they shouldn't necessarily be complaining. In unusual facts, a 2,000-year-old scroll discussing the dynasties after the Alexander the Great have been deciphered by AI. So after Mount Vesuvius went off in 79 CE, I'm sure you guys have seen the stories or the pictures of the village in Pompeii that were just covered in ash and there were people frozen kind of in time. That's actually been, I thought that was really interesting. And vinyl record sales outperformed CDs for the first time since 1987. There's been a 71% amount of sales of vinyl account for all of the physical format revenues, and it's the 7th consecutive year, and they've reached a high of $15.9 billion. The more that we get modern, the more that we want to go back in time. That's the news for this week, guys. I mean, if you guys have any questions, don't forget to subscribe, and remember, the preppers were right.